So you can welcome
And now we are live. Welcome to our June Bicycle and Pedestrian Commission meeting. To first get introductions, we'd just like to have Eric do a roll call.
Okay. We've got Mary Sill.
Here.
Dwight Otwell.
Here.
Elizabeth Alley.
Here.
Carrie Barsness.
Here.
Liz Hester.
Here.
Nick Neptune.
Here.
Pierre Tong.
Here.
Robert Parrish.
You're muted again, Robert.
I got you.
I'm here.
There you go. And Susan Hatchell.
I'm here.
And for city staff, we've got myself, Eric Lamb, Paul Black, Fontaine Burris, and Barbara Goodwin. And then we have a number of staff members that are also going to be participating as part of the meeting this evening. So thanks for working with us on this. And since we got started a little awkwardly, we need to have another motion to approve the minutes.
Yes, absolutely. So could I have everybody review the minutes? And if there are any amendments, please state them.
So this is Liz. I'd like to note that I was actually absent from the last meeting, even though I was given credit for being there.
I want to note that I was marked as absent from the meeting, but I was present.
They do look a lot alike, so I could see how.
Susan Hatchell makes a motion to approve.
And a second?
Mr. seconds the motion.
All in favor, please raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Great. So now we have an opportunity for, do I need to say all in favor, say aye? Okay, sounds good. So now we'll move on to public comment. I think we are having this time, Eric, was Paul Neville able to join us?
Paul is on the call, and I'll be happy to port him in. If there's anyone else that's on the call that would like to make public comments, if you will, please type those into the chat window, and I can read those into the record. So give me 1 second.
Paul served on the commission for 6 years, which is pretty impressive. And we, of course, in normal times would give Paul a big send off, and we can't do that at this time. So we would love to have Paul, come here tonight to just say something briefly. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Fine. Can you see me and can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Well, that's okay. Don't know why the video isn't working, but I've enjoyed watching you so far tonight. For the record, my name is Paul Neville, and I live at 1341 Cameron View Court in Raleigh. And since BPAC's been an important part of my life for over 6 years, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for the great experiences since I've now finished my terms. Thanks to you BPAC members for your good hard work and respect that you brought to the commission. And I also want to thank Raleigh staff because they give us lots of good information that we need to make good decisions. So I appreciate that. And a special thanks to Eric, who's been with me for my entire experience. And he's probably grown either fond or sick of me, or probably at certain times both, right? But it's been great to see BPAC become a viable, recognized force for change in Raleigh's infrastructure. We've got a seat at the table for decision making, and we all know how important that is. So I hope that you all keep that up. And if I was giving only advice, I would say make sure that our commission represents all people in all areas of Raleigh. That's really hard because many voices need to be heard, and it's really difficult to find a path that pleases everyone. In fact, you won't please everyone. So the way that you take all the different views from all the different parts of Raleigh is going to reflect well on BPAC and the city of Raleigh in general for our decisions about bike and pedestrian infrastructure. So thanks again for the time I've had and the good experiences I've had on the commission.
Thank you, Paul. we look forward to being able to see you sometime in the future and celebrate your service.
Well, thank you, and good luck going forward. I hope that you can all be in person soon and we all can be back to normal meetings as well.
Agreed.
Come visit.
And
Well,
Madam Chair, as a point of personal privilege, let me just say thank you to Mr. Neville, not just for his years of service, but also for his leadership. And we appreciate not just what you've done with the commission, but your willingness to help out with all the events and things that we've had. We really appreciate your selflessness. So on behalf of the employees of the City of Raleigh, thank you very much.
well, thanks, Eric. That's very good to hear. I appreciate it. Thank you. And now I'll be happy to be muted and drop off so you can get on to business.
Thank you, Paul.
And Madam Chair, just to let you know, Kelly has joined the meeting.
Oh, thanks for joining, Kelly. Glad to have you here. I'm unable to see her on video, but I think I just heard her on audio. All right. So now do we have has anybody typed any public comments to you, Eric?
Unmute myself. I do not have any requests for public comment at this time.
Okay, sounds good. Let's move along then to the Capitol Boulevard study. Hey, Kelly.
Okay, give me 1 second. I need to promote some folks into the attendee here. So. Hi, John, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Do I need to bring any of your team into the mix?
Nope, just me for now.
Okay, thank you.
And I think do you have the slides or should I pull up the slides?
I have them. Hang on 1 second.
Great. All right, well, while we're doing that, I can introduce myself. I'm John Anagnost. I work in the Planning and Development Department, and I am working on the Capitol Boulevard North Corridor Study, which has been going on for about 2 years now and deals with the portion of Capitol Boulevard between I-440 and I-540. And so we are in the phase of that before the pandemic, where we were preparing to have a public engagement process for bicycle and pedestrian improvements that we're proposing. And so that's what you're going to see this evening. But to begin the presentation, I do want to give a little bit of background about the study, just so you know all the different layers that are involved before we get to the bicycle component. So next slide, please. And then I'll talk a little bit about the actual bicycle and pedestrian proposals. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the study area is from I-440 to I-540, and it is mainly the commercially zoned parcels on either side. And it is the primary focus of the study is transportation. We will have some land use recommendations, but it is the core motivation for the study is the anticipation of considerably more traffic volume on Capitol Boulevard in the coming 25 years or so, and how to manage that effectively for all modes of transportation. Next slide, please. So here's the timeline. We were originally intending to be starting to draft the final report at this point. That's been pushed back by a few months because of the pandemic. And so at this point, if we're able to resume public outreach activities, we think we could get it finished by the end of the calendar year. Next slide, please. All right, and then next one, yep. And so the components of the study, like I said, the primary motivation is vehicular transportation improvements, and then full multimodal perspective on the street improvements, and then land use, bicycle and pedestrian improvements, and then some policies about how development should take place in the future and how that can be something that emphasizes really the cool diversity that there is present on Capitol Boulevard today. And next slide, please. All right, so the first part of the study is the street improvements, as I mentioned, and so that is focusing mainly on Capitol Boulevard, and that has two parts that are integrated in order for it to function. So the first part is a proposal for a series of interchanges on Capitol Boulevard. So pretty much all of the major intersections, signalized intersections on Capitol Boulevard, are proposed to be converted into grade-separated interchanges. And so that raises a question. The point of that is to increase the capacity for vehicular traffic, but that raises the question of, well, how do you accomplish that without causing a lot of negative impacts for the existing urban development that's there? And so the next slide, please, shows how that can be accomplished. Which is through a multi-way boulevard. Eric, can we advance one slide? And so what that means is that there would be separate types of vehicle lanes on Capitol Boulevard. And so lanes closer to the center of the roadway would be for regional travel, and they would have limited access to get on and off of Capitol Boulevard, meaning basically there would only be 4 or 5 points along the 4.5 miles between 440 and 540 where you would be able to enter those middle lanes. And then the outer lanes are for your local travel. And so those would have all the same, most of the same access points as today. Some may need to be closed in order to accommodate the interchanges, but most of the access points would remain open. So shopping centers, neighborhood streets could still have access to those local lanes on the outside. And so we think that's going to create a balance between the need for that commuter capacity, people trying to get to downtown, to 440 to 5, also to allow the vibrant urban area that's there today. And so the next slide shows an image of how that comes together. And so this is the most common type of interchange that's proposed by the Capitol Boulevard North Corridor study. It's called a tight diamond or urban diamond. And so you can see how when you reach an intersection, those outer lanes would have signals that allow cars to then make turns to the east or west and get onto cross streets like Spring Forest Road or Buffalo Road. And I will point out that this image shows the street that is analogous to Capitol Boulevard passing underneath the bridge. For many of the interchanges on Capitol Boulevard, the way that the topography is, it probably would be that Capitol Boulevard would be elevated and the cross street would pass under a bridge that carries Capitol Boulevard over. So that's just something to keep in mind. And the other thing I'll note at this point is that in some streets, the current proposal for Capitol Boulevard North is that there not be a full movement interchange, that you would not be able to make all the turning movements. In some places, we're recommending that it only be right in, right out, so that you could really only make right turns onto the side street from the local lane, or from the side street onto the local lane, and there wouldn't be a way for vehicles to cross Capitol Boulevard at some of those smaller cross streets. And in those locations, we're proposing a pedestrian bridge, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Next slide, please. So then along with that, we're making some recommendations for land development. We anticipate there being demand for additional residential and office development in this area. That's based on a real estate study that we had conducted. Next slide, excuse me, not next slide. So these are the 3 areas that we're seeing that could potentially have the capacity for that, which is Triangle Town Center at the north end, Mini City in the central portion, which is between Calvary Drive and Millbrook on the west and North New Hope on the east. And then at the south end, there is Highwoods and Westinghouse, where they meet Capitol Boulevard, another area where we have created some land use policies. So the next slide shows what that can look like in the Highwoods area. And so that is recommended types of uses, whether residential, office, or commercial, or a combination, and then what heights would be appropriate. And the next slide shows that we can integrate that with some urban form policy recommendations that say that there should be secondary streets that basically create a more walkable urban area with integrated land uses that are not fronting directly on Capitol Boulevard. Capitol Boulevard is not the most pleasant place to walk today, and so we think that there can be new streets that provide a great walking environment that doesn't rely on Capitol Boulevard. So that's what that urban form policy can encourage. And then the next slide shows if these policy maps are implemented through private redevelopment, then we could see potentially a recreation of those areas to look more like this. And so that is basically the initial phases of the Capitol Boulevard North Corridor study, which is coming up with those street improvement recommendations, then adding the layer of the land use recommendations. And so this third layer that we're going to talk about this evening is to then say, well, how do those things get linked together for a full multimodal experience? And if you noticed on the multi-way boulevard section at the beginning, what was in the middle of Capitol Boulevard was dedicated lanes for bus rapid transit. And so that's the first multimodal element, is that Capitol Boulevard itself is proposed to have bus rapid transit, and there would be a BRT station at each one of those interchanges that is proposed. And so that creates a great way to travel along Capitol Boulevard without a private vehicle. And so then there's a question of how can we supplement that with bicycle and pedestrian facilities. And so the next slide, we'll start talking about that. We can advance 2 slides. It's just going to be, okay, so there. Oh, I'm sorry, go back 1, please, Eric. And so when we started thinking about planning for bicycle and pedestrian improvements, we looked at the existing bike rally plan, of course, and then the priority bikeway plan that emerges from that. And then we have our consultant Tool Design perform some analysis, as well as our lead consultant WSP, of the level of traffic stress, transit access, and an analysis of equity based on demographic data from the corridor area. And so the next couple slides are just showing those maps. Those maps are also in the map set that's included with the agenda. So if you want to look at those in more detail, I think you have those available. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but just to let you know that those are kind of the inputs that went into this planning. And so traffic stress, as you can imagine, Capitol Boulevard itself, not the most pleasant in its current form. But then there are a number of neighborhood streets on either side that are more comfortable for walking and cycling. And some of the cross streets have differing levels of comfort as well. Next slide, please. Access to transit, of course, Capitol Boulevard currently has the Route 1 bus service, which is the highest ridership transit route currently in Raleigh. And there are a number of crosstown connectors that also access Route 1 and provide transit service to the east and west, and also north towards the Wake Technical Community College North Wake campus. And so it is a well-served area for transit currently, and that would only improve with bus rapid transit. And so we want to make sure that any bicycle and pedestrian improvements are going to link those things together. Next slide, please. And so when we put those things together, we did an initial analysis that is a pretty technical analysis, just to give us a basic framework of where we think is going to be the most desired places for better bicycle and pedestrian facilities. And so that's where this map comes from. This was kind of our first take based on the criteria that we put together. And so then from there, we kind of took a little deeper dive, looked at what's on the ground, and also looked at how did these improvements get implemented, and how do we think through, how do we accomplish, if we do want to have these improvements, how will that actually take place? And so the next slide talks a little bit about the way we envision implementation, and then as we walk through these steps of implementation, we will see the layers of each one, and at the end we can kind of look at how that comes together. And so the 3 ways that we see bicycle and pedestrian improvements being implemented on Capitol Boulevard, or around Capitol Boulevard, is city street improvement projects. So those are the streetscaping projects and street construction projects, which are happening regularly all the time. And there are a number that are actually either in planning or in construction around Capitol Boulevard right now. And so that's a way that we can try to implement some of these recommendations in the near term. And then as I went over at the beginning, this corridor study is proposing to rebuild Capitol Boulevard itself and a number of the intersections on Capitol Boulevard with grade separated interchanges. And so those are opportunities to incorporate new bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And that's especially important because of the BRT connection. And then finally, private redevelopment is something that can lead to the construction of new public streets. And a lot of that comes from the street plan map, as well as the Unified Development Ordinance standards in there, as well as the street design manual. And so that is a third way that we can look at doing this. And the next slide will talk about the timeframes that we see for those. And so there, like I said, there are a few projects that are already in planning or under construction. And so those will be bringing new bicycle lanes and sidewalks in the next, in the near term. And then if we can use this study to encourage there to be other street improvement projects to be funded, that can supplement those. And then the Capitol Boulevard corridor itself and the interchanges is something that if we are able to get funding into funding programs through the North Carolina Department of Transportation, it looks like could start construction about 10 years from now. And then depending on the way that those projects break out into different segments and different projects, would take a number of years even after the first project is funded and goes into construction. So we're looking at that as a 10 to 20, or even for the whole corridor, potentially beyond the 20-year horizon for full completion. And then private redevelopment that leads to construction of streets on the street plan map, that is a little bit of an unknown variable because it does rely on private property owners making decisions about their property. It's not something that the city or the state can really impose on anyone, but it is something that we can write into our maps today. Next slide, please. So the first stage, as I mentioned, is looking at the normal streetscaping projects that the city does. And so here's a list of those projects that are already either in design phases or have been programmed into existing budgets or are under construction. And so this is actually a pretty good amount of projects in this area. This is pretty encouraging to know that these things will be in place in the next few years, providing for all these streets at least 6-foot sidewalks on either side, and for many of them providing a bicycle lane. And so that is a big help to the connections in this area. And so then we have to ask the question, okay, knowing that these are going into place, how do we then create a true network that's going to link these together and allow someone to really get around the corridor on a bicycle? And so the next slide will show, when we looked at that question, how we sort of prioritize different street projects. And so the map set that you have with your agenda has basically taken this. This was an earlier map that we used to think through this. And so what you have in your agenda packet is sort of the final version after we did this thinking. But you can see that we kind of thought through this hierarchy of prioritization based on those existing projects. And the next slide shows the north end. And so these maps can be a little bit busy, and it can be difficult to see the vision. And so the next slide has a map that I think is helpful. It's been helpful for me to think about this area because it is a little bit more simplified and shows, I think, what is a helpful way of imagining how a cyclist or a pedestrian might approach Capitol Boulevard once all these things are implemented, at least street projects, which is that when all these things come together, a person wanting to travel along Capitol Boulevard could really think of bus rapid transit, cycling, and walking as really easy and convenient things, alternatives to traveling in a private vehicle, if that is a true alternative for them. And for folks that don't have a private vehicle, can be much more convenient and safe. And so I think this really shows that what we're trying to accomplish is bicycle safe and convenient bicycle and pedestrian pathways on the east side and the west side that connect to public park facilities, connect to employment centers, connect to neighborhoods, and connect to bus rapid transit. And also give people a way to get across Capitol Boulevard in regular intervals so that barrier is reduced. So that's the first stage, which is street projects. The next slide, we'll talk about stage 2, which is the actual rebuilding of Capitol Boulevard and construction of interchanges. And so the city has a policy already on the books today, which is that when we have a grade separated interchange, there should be a protected bicycle facility that goes through that interchange, if there is a bicycle facility that passes through it. And so we have asked Tool, our consultants at Tool, to come up with some drawings that show what that will look like. And so the next slide shows those. Oh, I'm sorry. This slide is again reminding the locations of those interchanges along Capitol Boulevard. And so where you see the red circles on this map, that's where there's proposals for, well, 2 of the locations of red circles where you see the X's next to them is where there would be right in, right out interchanges, where we are proposing pedestrian bridges. And so those areas would have that improvement, and then the other interchanges would have these separated bicycle facilities that I was showing on the previous slide. And so you can see that those are pretty regular. It's about every third of a mile that you have a proposed interchange. And so that does give a lot of ability to cross Capitol Boulevard without having to go too far north or south before getting to a safe crossing. And so the next slide shows some images of what those crossings will look like. And so these drawings are going to be included in the final study report that we bring to the City Council. And the benefit of these is that, again, if and when NCDOT funds these projects and puts them into construction, these are guidance that we can offer them and say, these are the types of facilities that we would like to be included with these interchange projects. And so you can see we have a couple different varieties depending on the size of the cross street. And so in some cases, it may be that it's reasonable to combine sidewalks and bicycle lanes into one multi-use path on one side if it's a smaller cross street. In other situations for a larger cross street, it may be that we want to have sidewalks and a protected bicycle lane. Next slide, please. And so I'm sure you're all familiar with what a protected bicycle lane looks like, but you have some example images. And next slide, please. And then the pedestrian crossing. So we don't have any design recommendations for pedestrian bridges, but these are the general type of bridges that we would see. And of course, they would have to be ADA accessible. And then if they are integrated with a bus rapid transit station, then there would be probably more significant pedestrian access built in as part of the station design. I do want to say that the Capitol Boulevard North Corridor study is not a BRT planning study, and so we are not doing station design. We're not doing BRT route planning. We're simply saying that BRT makes sense for this corridor and that these interchanges make natural places for there to be stops. Next slide, please. All right, so the third stage that we see as implementation for these improvements is that when private property redevelops, there can be a requirement that the developer construct a public street through their property. And one of the ways that that can be required is through the street plan map. And so by adding streets to the street plan map, and designating the type of street, we can basically encourage for there to be better bicycle facilities in certain locations. And we, in addition to the general street cross sections that are in the street design manual that would be required by the street plan map, we are also working with the Urban Design Center to come up with some custom street sections for some of these streets, particularly in the land use vision areas that I mentioned earlier, to make them especially friendly to pedestrian and bicycle travel. So the next slide will show the street plan map. So this is the current street plan map around Capitol Boulevard, a limited area of it. And so you can see that the north-south network on either side is a little bit fragmented. And so the next slide shows the streets that we're proposing to add. And so what that would do is give a much more continuous parallel network in the north and south direction along Capitol Boulevard. And then when combined with the designations on the street plan map and custom street sections, can ensure that those parallel streets also provide a parallel bicycle corridor along Capitol Boulevard. And again, the time frame for that is unknown because it is reliant on private development. The next slide, please. So there are a couple of extra policies that we are going to be including in our recommendations that just have to do with some of the some particular areas around the study area that have somewhat unique contexts. And so the Marsh Creek Greenway is proposed to come through this area. So Marsh Creek passes underneath Capitol Boulevard, north of Trawick Road. And so currently there is not a way for that Greenway trail to be built with the current culvert. And so one of our recommendations would be that for any street improvements that come from this study, they should include construction of a way for a Greenway trail to pass underneath Capitol Boulevard. Another recommendation is, so if you notice on the street projects recommendation, the stage 1 map, there was a pretty heavy emphasis on North New Hope Road as being a parallel route for bicycles. And so that parallel route will have the most value if it is able to connect from Buffalo Road up to the mini city area, because there is a bit of a barrier with Lewisburg Road and just the existing neighborhood street network between Buffalo and Lewisburg is a little bit fragmented. And so that bicycle connection on North New Hope will have a lot of value if it makes that full connection from Buffalo across Lewisburg in one fell swoop. And so that's something we'd like to encourage. And then there is a recommended pedestrian crossing that we are proposing at Bog Street and Buffalo Road. And that would actually connect to an existing recreation area for a Raleigh Housing Authority development that's on the north side of Buffalo Road there. And they have an existing pedestrian path that goes through that recreation. It's a basketball court they have there and just a small outdoor passive recreation area. And so we'd like to see that have a better connection to the surrounding area. But the nature of Buffalo Road is that it is controlled by NCDOT, and putting a pedestrian crossing where there's not already a signalized intersection is not typically accepted. And so while we are proposing that, it's not something that under the current rules could be done. And so we'd have to have more conversation about that. And then finally, we have some areas where we see some gaps in the network through neighborhood streets, and we think it could be potentially off-road trails that are similar to Greenway trails in those locations using riparian stream corridors. But those things are similar to pedestrian crossings without a signalized intersection. Excuse me. Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources does not currently construct off-road trail facilities that are not linked to the Greenway Master Plan corridors. And so that would be something that would need to have additional conversation. All right, so that kind of sums up the bicycle and pedestrian proposals from Capitol Boulevard North. And then the next part of the presentation is really about a more conceptual idea that we have that we'd like to include in the study. And so we can go to the next slide, please. Which is that, a more robust bicycle network is something that we expect would immediately be used by fairly advanced cyclists and even people who aren't as advanced cyclists. But we know from our research that there's a significant population of older people who live along Capitol Boulevard, as well as people with young children. There are some census tracts along Capitol Boulevard where the median age is under 30. And so, for those users, there is a desire to make it as comfortable and as welcoming as possible to start to use the local non-motorized transportation network for people who maybe have felt unsafe doing that previously. And so that's what this idea is thinking through, is how can we invite people to get out and about on foot and on bicycles? And so the next slide will get into that question. And so these are sort of what we were thinking of when we thought of this amenity network idea. So comfort, access, and then can we build in some references to the diverse communities that do live in the area? So this part of Raleigh is one of the most diverse parts of Raleigh. It has a number of small businesses that serve local communities, local neighborhoods. And so we'd like to really celebrate that. So next slide, please. And so amenity network is not really a established term or established thing in the planning world, so far as we know. And so what we're envisioning with this is that along this bicycle and pedestrian network, could there be essentially what amount to pocket parks or small installations that give people something to draw them or something to occupy them? And it could be that it is just a place for rest if you're walking and you want to take a break, but also could be a destination if you want to exercise and go use an outdoor piece of exercise equipment. And so I'll show you what that means on the next few slides. So the next slide shows how that could be integrated with art. And some places even can have outdoor performance spaces or just sculpture or painting. Next slide. It can be play areas. Next slide. Exercise. Next slide. There could be educational aspects to these. The next slide. And again, it can just be that someone wants to take a break. And that could be integrated with a transit stop or an existing park facility. We really would like it to potentially be a waypoint for people to get to other places. And the next slide, please. And so that's where you could build in even wayfinding and say, if you keep going on this path where you've just stopped at this pocket park there, you will get to a full city park with a community center, or you will get to a shopping center or to a transit stop. Next slide. And then one of the things we've heard from the community in this area is there are concerns about portions of the study area that don't feel safe, particularly in the transition areas between shopping centers and neighborhoods, where there tends to be portions of the street that are not very active, that don't have storefronts facing them, that don't have homes facing them. And so, could these amenity areas also be places where we can add lighting and elements that make people feel safer moving around, particularly at nighttime? Next slide, please. And so when we look at this, we notice there are a lot of places, like I just mentioned, such as transition areas between neighborhoods and shopping centers around the corridor that aren't being really used for much currently. They could be used. Some of them are private property, some of them are public right-of-way, but aren't being used for a whole lot. And so the next few slides will show some examples of those. So next slide, please. So there are dead-end streets along the corridor where in the future there's likely to be a public street connection, but currently, as you can see here, can be used for things like illegal parking and dumping, which is not something that is good for the community. Next slide. There are stream corridors that are currently just used as utility easements, but could potentially have more value to the community. Next slide. Unused areas that are, the edges of shopping centers or, excess pieces of right-of-way. Could those potentially be used? Next slide, please. And then this is actually a transit stop next to the mini city shopping center near a parking lot with a large wall behind it and an empty yard area. And so that really seems like an unused opportunity. So next slide, please. And then this is the area along Buffalo Road across from Bog Street that I mentioned near the Raleigh Housing Authority development, where they have a basketball court and a small recreation area. And so could that be connected to the pedestrian network? Next slide, please. And then this is the edge of Spring Forest Park, which will be connected to the improvements on Fox Road. So this will actually be connected to a sidewalk very soon. Next slide, please. And so the thought is that, again, as I said before, you know, for folks who are not the most advanced cyclists or who haven't historically felt terribly comfortable walking around this area, is there a way we can make it more welcoming to do so? And next slide, please. And this could be an iterative thing where there are portions of it that are built that have value and benefit by themselves, and then it can be kind of stacked on top of each other. And so if you advance one slide, Eric, I'll show kind of one more, and again, that, you know, there could be portions of it that are built at a time that stand alone, but then when they come together, it really makes a cool amenity network. And this is kind of taking that site at Mini City and saying, you know, what if there was bicycle parking at that transit stop and a wayfinding sign with a map? What if that wall behind there was painted with a mural? And what if there was a small play area? So if someone has walked their children to the bus stop, their children can have a little bit of active recreation while they wait for the bus. So that's the kind of thing we're thinking through. Now, this is something that when we presented to the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Department before the pandemic, of course, there was hesitation of how does this get funded and who would maintain it. And I think with the pandemic, that question is even more relevant, and it was relevant before. So that amenity network idea is really more something that we want to just say is conceptual and could be the subject of future study. And so the next steps in this is we would like to try to organize a public outreach process to let the community look at these ideas and give us some feedback in the next few months, and then do any revisions that we'd like to make based on what we hear from them and from you and other stakeholder groups in the community. And then the final study report we hope to have together by the end of the calendar year. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I've got a question. This is Robert.
Yes.
The one question I have is, do you have a projected cost for this project?
For the Capitol Boulevard street improvements or just for the bicycle and pedestrian improvements?
I was including the whole enchilada.
Yeah, so for Capitol Boulevard, the street improvements, so rebuilding this Capitol Boulevard street itself and then building all of those interchanges, the preliminary cost estimate that we've gotten from the consultant is $850 million. And we think that's pretty reasonable. Of course, with any project like that, it ends up usually being a little more expensive than the initial projections. And then for the bicycle and pedestrian components, we really haven't been doing a ton of thinking about the cost because we think of that as being recommended for the existing rotating funding mechanisms that the city has. And so, you know, that is not so much a cost question as a time question. You know, how long will it take for those projects to make it to the top of those lists of those funding streams that the city has?
Okay, all right. And yeah, I think that it sounds reasonable for everything that's included, even with the increases that will happen, but it may approach it. Yeah, $1 billion. Hopefully it won't, but it could. But it sounds reasonable. Second question, this is an ADA question. Would there be any need to place more stoplights on Capitol Boulevard, and particularly, could these stoplights have audible signals?
Yep, that's a great question. So the image I showed of the tight diamond interchange earlier, what that shows is that when Capitol Boulevard comes to a cross street, the outer lanes, those local travel lanes, will come up a ramp, and there will actually be a signalized intersection on each side of that interchange that will allow those two sets of outer lanes from Capitol Boulevard to have access to the local cross street. And so at each of those intersections, they will be required to have the full ADA accessibility. So that would be audible signals for pedestrian crossings. And then the other benefit of the interchanges is that unlike the current at-grade intersections on Capitol Boulevard, where someone walking needs to generally attempts to cross the entire width of Capitol Boulevard with one signal phase, because the medians tend to be small, and it's not terribly comfortable to stop on the medians on Capitol Boulevard. So you do see people crossing the full, 150, 160 foot width in one signal phase, or attempting to. That with those interchanges, you would have that width be broken up by two traffic signals, and then the bridge in between would have a sidewalk that would be the width of those inner regional travel lanes that are passing under the bridge. And so that's, going to be a good 60 to 80 feet wide. And then in many of those interchanges, if BRT is implemented, that bridge would also have an access point to the BRT station. So there actually would be a stairway there to get down to the boarding platform for the BRT. And so what that does is it means when a pedestrian approaches that interchange, they will have an intersection with an audible signal to cross 2 to 3 lanes of the local vehicle lanes, have a refuge that is quite significant and may include a BRT stop, and then be able to cross the second signalized intersection, again with an audible signal, and again only 2 to 3 lanes of vehicles, and then get to the other side. And so that, we think, is going to be much more comfortable for pedestrians than the current way it works.
Brother, if I could, I'd give you a hug. That sounds outstanding.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Do we have any other questions or comments from the commission? Elizabeth?
Hey, John.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going for hands.
Sorry.
Kira, do you want to go ahead and then we can do Elizabeth?
Yeah, sorry, Elizabeth. You gave some great examples for the tight diamond and what that might look like. I see there's a SPUI at Buffalo. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So the SPUI is a single point urban interchange, and that would operate very similarly to the tight diamond. So there would be the local lanes coming up the ramps or staying. Like I mentioned before, it's more likely that they'll actually stay at the same level that they are, and Capitol Boulevard would go up. So then there would be, Buffalo would likely pass underneath Capitol Boulevard. And
I hate to interrupt, but could we talk to a plan when we're talking about this? I'm having a hard time following what.
yes, certainly.
It would be great if we could go to one of these plans and walk through it for me, because I'm kind of losing how
we
these
have that
motions take
slide
place.
in the presentation with the interchange drawing. I think that could be helpful.
Thank
Okay,
you.
You give me 1 second, I'll do my best. But John, keep talking while I'm pulling it up.
And so it would be very similar to the tight diamond in that actually a typical single point urban interchange is called a single point because there's only one traffic signal that accommodates the travel from basically 6 different directions. And so in this case, the way that that's going to work, because it's a more urban format. So a good example of an existing single point urban interchange is Town Boulevard running north from Triangle Town Center, where it crosses 540. That intersection is a single point urban interchange. And you can kind of see, if you look at that on a map, what happens is the ramps coming off of 540 curve inward towards the underneath part of the bridge. And then they come together in a single signalized intersection. So what we're proposing at Buffalo Road is actually a modified SPUI, where there still would be 2 traffic signals, one on either side of Capitol Boulevard. But the way that the lanes are aligned, it would change the alignment of the lanes to facilitate access to Buffalo Road and New Hope Church Road, and make that east-west travel and and people going from that cross street to Capitol Boulevard, there would be additional capacity because that is a street where we know there's a lot of traffic volume in the east-west direction and accessing Capitol Boulevard currently. But in terms of the way that a pedestrian or a cyclist would traverse the interchange, it would be almost identical to the tight diamond, which is cross one signal on one side. You have a refuge if you don't have time in one phase in the middle of the interchange, and then you can cross the other side. And it also could be integrated with a BRT stop.
Okay, does that answer your question, Pierre? I'd like to move on to Elizabeth if so.
Yep. Thanks, John.
Welcome.
Elizabeth? You might be muted, I can't hear you. Or did,
Hear me?
yeah, can hear you.
Okay, sorry, pressed the wrong button. Thank you for your presentation, John. I had a couple comments. I feel like I just need to get it out of the way and say this. I think that this project, and I know that the idea of grade separating Capitol Boulevard was one that was not made by the city, but this project is bad for bicyclists and pedestrians and for people. I think you're doing the best with it that you can, but this is a road that is the width of a downtown city block. It's over 200 feet wide, and that's not urban. So I appreciate you making safety measures and the attempts to make third places. I think that's very smart. Specific recommendation, I noticed that this plan, these interchanges, especially grade separated one, involves slip lanes. Slip lanes are not easy to traverse for any mode other than a motorist. So I'd like to see consideration of removing those where possible. And then I would love to see some additional thought in the plan be given to how we can make these streets outside of Capitol Boulevard within the study area truly more multimodal. So not just adding a 6-foot sidewalk or a buffered bike lane, but calming the street, making them slower. I think that would make the third places more successful and help send the signal to redevelopment that you are anticipating that it also needs to be urban in flavor. Otherwise, you end up with Six Forks Road on North Hills East, which is the backside, and that's not a pleasant place to be. And my final comment was, knowing that this is a billion-dollar project and will take decades to implement, that we need to consider the needs and safety of existing users. And I'd love to see if you all are putting together any kind of like a phased implementation plan, how we can continue to improve these roads, including Capitol Boulevard. In the meantime, we've had, I know of at least one death in an intersection here within the past 6 months. So there are a lot of non-motorists in this area. Like you said, lots of young people, lots of older people. There's a lot of poverty in the area, and they need to be considered too. Thanks.
Okay.
So, Miss Alley, if I can address a couple of those items.
Sure.
So, number one, we've talked about this and the fact that we're not going to have slip lanes in the final design.
Good.
You've got some visualizations that were shown for development purposes, but we agree that's not going to be part of the final design that goes in. And this is more about getting our heads around the big picture concept that we're going to move towards structural solutions. And as it relates to pedestrian safety in the corridor, creating bridges and locations where people can cross the street safely and minimizing harm and minimizing the footprint of those intersections compared to what's out there right now is really a big goal for us. We've done a lot of interim steps in the last couple of years to improve pedestrian accessibility at all the intersections. And we're thankful that the crash rate in the Capitol Boulevard corridor has gone down, we think is a direct result of those investments. So there continue to be crashes, but not at the same rate that there has been. But I think if I can sort of sum up what John is bringing up here, the goal here is to lay this footprint, this vision for the corridor that's going to develop over a 30-year period. And it's important for us to get feedback from the commission. Is this the right long-term vision for the corridor?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you all are making some good strides in making it more of a people place, but I think the premise behind the entire project makes that very difficult.
I would also like to respond to the trying to work on traffic calming in the land use vision areas. And so we have been working with the Urban Design Center to come up with some custom street sections that we would like to apply there, and basically say, you know, where I showed that example from Highwoods and Westinghouse, you know, the urban form map showing that new parallel street network or that new local street network, which would be reinforced by the street plan, that we can make recommendations in the study that says when you see that street in the street plan of a particular designation, then it must be built with this custom section as shown in this corridor study. And so that's something that I was not able to put into this presentation, but will be part of the public engagement process for this. And it does have a little bit more detail about what those streets should look like in those locations.
I think that's great. And it looks like redevelopment will make kind of clusters of urban-ish development with slower roads. I would just recommend that you expand that notion of a custom street and thinking of a people street to the existing streets outside of new development and outside of Capitol Boulevard. So thinking about New Hope, Green, Buffalo, you know, the city, Eric rightfully said, you know, has made a lot of effort out there and has invested a lot. And while I think it is less fatal, it is not a pleasant place to be. People are using it because they have to. And we need to respect them and give them places that are dignified and safe and pleasant.
Agree. Eric, do we need to take any action on this tonight, or is this just for information? Okay. Yeah, I echo all your concerns, Elizabeth. I mean, it is, when you see some of the renderings, to see basically a highway being proposed is jolting when Capitol Boulevard is already such a dangerous corridor. I think that there are a lot of improvements on some of the intersections, independent of the floodplain discussion that were discussed when we're looking at some more protected facilities there. But then there's destinations all along the corridor. How is that being handled? Already that's an issue, and it seems like there would just be the opportunity to make that even worse if we're condensing into potentially fewer crossing areas in some instances if you're looking to create more of a freeway type of facility. But really appreciate the presentation. Does anybody else have any comments? Eric, did we have any public comment come through?
I did. Mary Jo Gellenbeck posted and said, as a multimodal user, the designs all make my heart race from imagining traversing the interchanges as a vulnerable road user.
All right, and I did see Dwight, I'm sorry, raise his hand as well.
That's right. Am I on?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. I had a question, if you would clear up for me. I don't quite understand what the recommendation is for integration with the greenway trails. One of the bullet points talked about non-greenway off-road paths related to the greenway. Could you explain that a little bit further, please?
Yeah. So currently in this area, there is one greenway trail proposed in the Capital Area Greenway Plan. That's Marsh Creek. And so that would run basically from Spring Forest Road on the west side of Capitol Boulevard along that riparian system along Marsh Creek down through Brentwood Park. And so that the only existing built portion of the trail is the one that's fully internal to Brentwood Park. And then that would pass across Capitol Boulevard and continue pretty much parallel to Brentwood Road, and then continue east until it then is proposed to cross 440 around, I forget the name of the street over there, and would link up to the Walnut Creek Greenway, or I'm sorry, Crabtree Creek Greenway. And so There is a portion of it on the west side that is included in the most recent slate of Campo projects that are asking for funding from NCDOT. It would not, that portion I don't think would connect to the existing built portion. And so basically when we looked at this, there's a couple of difficulties with doing really extensive greenway planning here. Number one, the lack of much existing infrastructure. Number two, a large portion of the planned trail is outside of this study area. Number three, we didn't see a lot of destinations that are near where that corridor is shown. And so what we have thought through is we want this study to propose as much as possible to at least make the area where that trail, the Marsh Creek Greenway, is proposed to come through here, facilitate that connection as well as possible. So that means making room underneath Capitol Boulevard and then providing the on-street connections in the area between Brentwood Road and High Woods Boulevard. And then on the west side, making the connections between Treywick and North Raleigh Boulevard. And that's really, so we're basically saying to the maximum extent possible, we want to make sure that anybody, when that trail is built out, it will be linked to this network that we're proposing and linked to these neighborhoods and these destinations on this corridor. We don't have a lot of ability with this study to be making major proposals about building out that greenway. And now there's also the Capital Area Greenway Plan is being updated in parallel with this study. And so we're expecting that to do some of that work. Now, in terms of the way that we wanted to think about the non-greenway off-road trails, there are a couple of areas in the corridor study area where there is unbuilt public right-of-way, or there is stream corridors that could provide connections, bicycle or pedestrian connections, without building a full public street. And the problem with that is that's not something that the city traditionally has done, is to say, here's a geographic connection that we can identify. Let's place a trail there, even if it's not part of the greenway system. And so that's why we can't actually propose a greenway trail in an area. And so a good example would be, so north of Starmount, if you are behind the Starmount Shopping Center, there is a stream corridor that runs from Starmount up and basically hits the dead end of Oates Drive and I forget the name of the other street, and runs parallel to Oates and parallel to Bog, and runs between Oates and Capitol Boulevard. We cannot propose a trail there because it would not be connected to the greenway system. And so there is no city department that's responsible for building or maintaining a trail of that nature. But we think it might be beneficial. And so what we're saying is, for some of those locations, we want to propose that the Greenway Master Plan update think about that question. Is it beneficial in some places to construct an off-road trail that's not part of the greenway system?
Eric, go ahead.
And that's going to be a point of policy discussion with this Greenway Master Plan update that's taking place right now. Sorry, pardon me.
New puppy.
That was the best possible timing for that. Thank you. Yes, that there's going to be a policy discussion about locating greenways outside of stream corridors specifically, and so it's something that you'll have an interest in, and John framed it up correctly. Also, we have one other public comment, this one from Joe Caruso. To Elizabeth's point, I would like to see more of a near-term solution proposed as well as in parallel, given this is a 20-plus year project at a minimum. For example, Capitol Calvary is a very high ridership bus stop area that consistently has pedestrian crashes. While they have declined, they're still high with quite substandard facilities.
Right. So this will be an iterative discussion, I'm sure. Elizabeth, do you have something brief to add?
Yeah, just on this point of whether or not it's a greenway, if it's within the right of way and it connects a street to a street, could you not just consider it a sidewalk?
That's true. It would not be considered part of the greenway system, but in terms of making those multi-use path connections, calling them out as part of this, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you so much, John. Our commission will look forward to continuing to provide feedback on these types of corridors and projects as they come across our, I don't know, work
Screen.
screen. We're all stuck at home for the foreseeable future. All right.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Eric, could we move on to the next item?
Yes, ma'am. I've got Mila Vega from our transit division with our transportation department here to talk about our BRT planning.
If I could just, before Mila starts, I would like to disclose that I'm involved in this project as a consultant. So if there is any voting or any of that nature, any statement of that nature, I should be recused. I don't know if we are supposed to take action or not tonight.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Eric. Also, I don't know if you've added Het Patel. We will be co-presenting together.
Thank you. I can do that.
While Het is joining, and he will take the first part of the presentation, I will quickly give an overview and the purpose of this presentation and requested action at the end. We will be providing an update on where New Bern BRT is with 30% design. We will provide an update on the work that is currently planned to get New Bern BRT to final design, as well as setting some system standards for the entire Wake BRT system. And I wanted to point out specifically that I know this board is very interested in detailed markings and some of the design elements. So I will kind of preview of where it's coming and the team that will be working on this task, as well as a task of finalizing downtown routing, because I know we have been working with the BPAC ad hoc subcommittee quite a bit on that before the pandemic. So some of this information you will see in the presentation, and I'll be happy to answer additional questions. And then at the end, we will request support for proposed bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure along the New Bern corridor, so we would greatly appreciate your consideration. So this is my opening statement. Hopefully Het is on, and I will mute myself and let him present the first part of the presentation.
Thanks, Mila. Hi, this is Het Patel, Senior Planner within the BRT team. Eric, can you go to the next slide, please? So Mila already kind of gave a quick update of the agenda and what we're going to be discussing today. I will walk through our design process for Wake BRT New Bern Avenue, specifically as it relates to bicycle pedestrian infrastructure and how that's being incorporated into the design. And then Mila will follow through with the 30% design and the next steps for the program. Next slide. So as it relates to the entire program for Wake BRT, we have 4 corridors, and currently New Bern Avenue is the most advanced in terms of design. 30% design was completed in March by WSP for this corridor, and we actually had a video in May that got published. So if you haven't seen it yet, I will send it a link to Eric in the chat, and he can maybe post it after this presentation. But that basically highlights the 30% design and what we're going to go over today. The next steps for New Bern is HNTB, which is the final design team, will take it into 100% design. The southern and western corridors for BRT are advancing on parallel tracks. They're both undergoing route selection, or also known as the locally preferred alternative selection. There are various alternatives for both corridors, and we're working through the engagement process to narrow those down and have the councils take action on what the preferred route is. And then the last but not least, the Capitol corridor, the northern corridor, which is either Capitol or West Street, will begin looking at the route for that corridor in the fall of this year, towards the end of this year. Next slide. So as it relates to the design for New Bern Avenue, there was the existing conditions, as well as in the previous years leading up to this work for BRT, there was a sidewalk project along New Bern Avenue that a lot of you might be aware of, that had identified two designs between two different sections from about Tarboro, Raleigh Boulevard to Sunnybrook. And so once BRT design sort of kicked off in 2019, we had the initial New Bern Avenue design open house in June, and then we had a second design open house in October, both of which where we heard a lot of concern about the lack of dedicated infrastructure for bicycle pedestrians along the corridor, some of the safety concerns as it related to bicycle and pedestrians for the corridor. And so that analysis altogether has gone into a recommendation that we presented to the City Council in March of this year, which was to combine the New Bern Avenue Sidewalk Pedestrian Improvements Project with the New Bern BRT project. And we have, at 30% design for this project, a revised design from a bicycle pedestrian perspective that incorporates the sidewalk project and provides a continuous 12-foot multi-use path from downtown, from about Blunt Street all the way to Wake Med, Sunnybrook Road. Next slide. And so this design did incorporate NACTO standards. So we looked at, the recommended for shared use paths is a 10 feet minimum. The 30% designs that we're showing now have a 12-foot multi-use path. And the NACTO designs, again, for the New Bern Avenue conditions, it kind of lines up for the shared use path concept and provides a continuous infrastructure along the entirety of the corridor. And then with certain enhanced on-street improvements that will also be made at crossings, it will help the bicycle pedestrian infrastructure along the entire corridor. Next slide. And so looking at the level of service on shared use path volumes in the NACTO standards, we would need about 200 users within a peak hour along New Bern Avenue to have a level of service B, and actually an additional 100 for that level of service to drop at all at that 12-foot multi-use path level. So the level of B service stands for good, where you have pretty good bicycling conditions and retain significant room to absorb more users while maintaining high-quality user experience for both the bicyclists and pedestrians. Mila did indicate, there will be, as we get into final design, the final design team looking at more specifically some of the concerns that we've heard from the BPAC before about markings and signage for the multi-use path, and that we will get to when we get further in final design. So this is where I'll hand it off to Mila to talk through the 30% design and the next steps for the entire Wake BRT program.
Thank you, Head. Next slide, please. So you've seen this slide before, but just a refresher, this is what the current corridor looks like. We have 3 distinct segments from downtown at Go Raleigh Station to approximately Pool Road intersection. BRT will be operating along the right side of the road. You can see a graphic below that shows bus on the right with parking and then sidewalks. And then from Pool Road intersection and all the way to Sunnybrook, where Wake Med is located, we propose to have BRT in the median running transitway. And again, you can see the graphic at the bottom. So this is a fully dedicated BRT facility, completely separated from traffic. And finally, from Sunnybrook all the way to New Hope, the area with Walmart and some of the other stores, BRT will be operating in mixed traffic. However, BRT infrastructure will include stations with level boarding, and also it will be supported by transit signal priority to make sure that buses can get through intersections and stay on schedule. Next, please. So this is some of the renderings that can show what those segments look. And we also shared this information with the council when we provided an overview of the 30% design. At the top right corner, you can see a little key map with a direction arrow. So it will help you orient yourselves where along the corridor you're looking at and in which direction. So this is the downtown section, and this treatment will be very typical for the entire downtown. I'll look for the New Bern. You can see a bus operating on the right with general purpose lanes adjacent to BRT lane, and then you see parking lane. So one thing I forgot to note is where we have this BRT on the right side, it's called Business Access and Transit, or BAT lanes. We are using right BAT lanes. And what it means is, unlike fully dedicated transitway facility, in this case, cars are allowed to enter this facility for a short period of time to either pull into a driveway or access a garage, etc. So while they're not supposed to be driving in the BRT lane for an extensive period of time, they are allowed to enter the facility. Next slide. So again, I just want to point out where that little key map is and the direction. This is heading away from downtown. And this is a clip you will be, if you watch the BRT video, you'll see something very similar. So you can see where BRT lane is on the right side of the facility. And this is where 12 feet wide multi-use path picks up. And then you can see a station placed for scale. To kind of get an idea of what BRT station could look like as far as, again, scale, not the specific design. We will be getting some of this detailed design decisions over the next 12 months. And just since I'm on 30% design, kind of talking about it, I'll note that our current goal to get to about 65% design that will provide more clarity and some of the decisions about design details by December. So this is our current timeline to get it to 65 by December. Next slide, please. So this is the transitway. This is that section between Pool Road and Sunnybrook. And again, you can see on the key, it's approximately in the middle of the corridor. You can see BRT in the operating in the center of the roadway. Multi-use path continues all the way to Wake Med, and then you can see that stations are also located along the median with crosswalks and pedestrian operated signals to be able to cross safely. There is also pedestrian refuge. And then the platform ramp will taper down from the platform to make sure this is also ADA accessible. Next slide, please. So as we wrapped up the 30% design in New Bern, but we also have 2 more corridors coming up. And I had mentioned that we currently are working through selecting the preferred routing. Which means we also need to pick up the work that was left off with the downtown plan and help us really fine-tune the downtown route. So over the next 3 to 4 months, we will be working with WSP, our consultant that was selected for 0 to 30% design on all 4 corridors, and we will be fine-tuning the routing recommendation for the southern corridor connecting to Garner, western corridor connecting to Raleigh, as well as taking a closer look at the recommendations from the downtown plan and refining them. So we know where BRT infrastructure could be incorporated within downtown. As you remember, downtown plan did leave several options on the table, and we're working with BPAC ad hoc subcommittee on addressing some of the questions that still needed more work. Next slide, please. So now we are adding another, slide disappeared. So now we are adding another team to our consultants team. HNTB was selected to take New Bern to final design from 30 to 100%, as well as develop subsystem standards. We are currently working on routing the contract, so we'll have a full contract in place. They are working on the limited scope of service right now because we wanted to make sure that they can pick up the work from WSP and initiate the transfer of files. But what they will be working on, obviously they will be taking New Bern to final design. So this is where some of the details of markings and signage and placement of certain facilities will come in place. Also, they will be working on system-wide standards, which would address wayfinding and making sure that standards that are set for New Bern are also the same standards that are set for the same system. So the reason we try to kind of split it up into final design and then system-wide standards is we would like to focus on creating a system that would be seamless to a user, no matter if they're using a system along New Bern or they go travel on the Western Boulevard, if they travel on the Northern Corridor. They all know where things are placed and how to use the system. It's not only important for the overall user experience, but it's very important from the ADA perspective because people don't have to guess where a bench could be located, where a ticket vending machine could be located. They have a good understanding of where the bus door should be. So all these little elements that kind of go into the placement of amenities and layout and the flow through station, that should be seamless throughout the system. And that's the idea behind having that element of work with a view at the entire Wake BRT program. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of some of the high, touch points and milestones. We did take New Bern 30% design to council back in March, and then we went we took a contract for HNTB to council in June. So we're kind of working for all of that. And then we are amending WSP contract so they can focus on downtown routing, helping us select the locally preferred alignments, and help us with some of the public engagement that will be consolidated with HNTB. So just to clarify too, with WSP, we currently will be working on the limited scope because we feel we need to do a little bit more work and organize a little bit better over the next 3 to 4 months, like fine-tune the downtown routing, before we jump in and do a full scope and really dig into the preliminary design and environmental work. So we're just trying to position ourselves so that we are truly ready to start designing sometime this fall, potentially October timeline. And then, as I mentioned, our goal to have New Bern at 65% design is December, and we are aiming at Western and Southern LPA recommendation this fall. Next slide. So I know we discussed this project extensively with BPAC, and I know BPAC has a lot of interest in the more advanced design and some of the details of, again, signage and parking and wayfinding and treatments of pedestrian crosswalks as well as pedestrian signals. But before we go to that point, we really need to lock in the concept of, okay, these are the pedestrian and bicycle facilities that at a high level make up the corridor. So we just want to be all on the same page before we really dive in and start producing more refined details that this body is interested in. And this is the requested action today is for BPAC to consider providing a letter of support for some of the improvements included in the project, specifically a multi-use path, and making sure that we all on the same page and we can start spending more of our resources and consultant time in digging into some of the details and refining the plans. So that's the presentation. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'd like to discuss all of these myself now.
Now, I can't see everybody's hands at this point, but does anybody, because we still have the presentation up, but I can scroll through. Does anybody have any, oh, here we go, questions or comments?
I'm sorry to be the first to interrupt, but I believe at this point I may need to ask for someone to make a motion to recuse me.
I'll make a motion to recuse Susan.
Second.
All right. Anybody looking to provide input or questions? I think I saw Elizabeth's hand.
Madam Chair, you need to vote on that.
Oh, sorry. All in favor?
Aye.
Sorry, Susan.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I had a couple questions about the multi-use path, understanding that the design details are in the future. It looks in the renderings like you have a verge, at least near the station, where the path is set back from the road a little bit. Is that true for the entirety of the multi-use path?
There will be certain areas where it can go a little bit further, a little bit closer. I mean, it just depends on where some of the utilities are placed and, the right of way. Obviously, we know everything is not ideally uniform and symmetric. So it might shift a little bit here and there. We just really need to be mindful of utilities. Sometimes it's easier to move the path than relocate a very expensive utility. But so, yeah, it probably will not be just a straight shot. It could, go up a little bit.
Okay. To me, the dimension of that multi-use path is sufficient if you can keep everything out of it. Things like lights and benches and things like that. And hopefully we will be including street trees in that buffer. And then my second question was about the dimension of the sidewalk on the north side of New Bern, east of Tarboro is 6 feet. That is one place where, if it would be possible, I think adding a couple of feet there would be ideal. The 12-foot multi-use path west of Tarboro works well because you have the addition of a 6-foot sidewalk and 2 5-foot sidewalks to accommodate both eastbound and westbound traffic. East of Tarboro, it seems like all of the bicycle traffic would be concentrated on the south side of the street on that multi-use path, because I don't think there was an in-road bike marking westbound there. So if the intention is that westbound bicycle traffic, I don't know, is the idea that it would be bidirectional bicycle traffic on the multi-use path, or are you hoping that it'll go on the north side?
On the multi-use path, the current level of service that HED was reviewing, it assumes bidirectional traffic.
Okay, so bidirectional for both modes.
Correct.
Okay.
And then sorry to jump in real quick, but in the stretch that you're talking about, Elizabeth, I guess for pedestrian, you would have an option on the north side, like you said. So the pedestrian traffic could be split in that area. One of the reasons why BRT design from a sidewalk pedestrian perspective wasn't doing a whole lot in that section is we're not touching the curb along the north side of New Bern for that stretch.
I thought there was no curb.
Well, so I guess what I'm trying to say is the BRT construction work is staying away from that northern section. So as part of the bicycle pedestrian improvements, we were focusing on that southern portion and providing the 12-foot multi-use path on that side.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
then-
that's a good.
Please, go ahead.
Just a little bit before we move on, that's a good point because to accommodate multi-use path where we are actually putting it in, we are moving the curb into the roadway to gain more space to be able to put all of that, to put the path and then to put the planting barrier.
Yeah, that's why I was asking the question, because I understand that the right-of-way acquisition is expensive and there's a lot of topography there and existing active homeowners, but we have one chance to get it right. So it doesn't hurt to ask. It'd be great to get a verge on the south side, and then on the north side, if we can increase over 6 feet, since that's new construction sidewalk, new setting of curb and gutter, it'd be great, whether or not that is through the BRT project or through the funding from the petition project. Just putting that on the record. And then my final nitpick, understanding that we aren't in design yet, is your renderings aren't showing ramp type driveways. But I think that's an important part of a multi-use path there. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments from the commission? Kari? You're muted. There you go.
So this is my first meeting, so this may have already been addressed, but as I understand it, the purpose of combining pedestrian thoughts into the BRT plan is to ensure people actually have easy access to use the BRT. But what I'm seeing in this map is great attention, which I think is obviously needed because Newburgh is a very busy street, the east-west corridor. But people don't just live on Newburgh. People live north of Newburgh, they live south of Newburgh. And this would apply to Western Boulevard as well. I live north of Western Boulevard. What consideration is being given to incorporate north-south pedestrian and cycle access to get to those BRT stops wherever they end up being?
This is a true statement for any transit facility. Every single transit rider gets there either by bike or by foot. So there's something that we'll be looking at. We did for station areas, for that footprint around the station, and I'm not talking about specifically platform and accessing, but land use around stations. We are working with the City of Raleigh Planning Department, developing station area plans. So we just received a grant from the Federal Transit Administration, and one of the requirements of that grant is to address multimodal connectivity. So now we'll be looking at land use. But as we are looking at land use and some of the recommendations, we will be looking at making sure that there is a logical connection to the surrounding land use and surrounding greenways and infrastructure that leads away or to the stations. So while this is obviously not, it will have a limit. We have to determine that boundary around the station. But the project will be looking at some of that, not just along the Newburgh belt, but in those nodes where the stations, 10 stations are located. That work we just received the grant. We are coordinating with the planning department on trying to figure out our approach, especially given the fact that it's very difficult to communicate with the public and have public engagement, and this is a critical component of that work. But we will be communicating our approach to council this fall after they come back from the break, and hopefully by the end of this year, maybe early next year, we can really dig into this work and start developing station area plans that have a multimodal component.
That's great news on that grant. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Robert, is that your hand being raised?
This is an indirect question, but I think it may be a benefit. As a legally blind person, those ticket machines, how accessible are they to a blind person? And what I mean by that is, do they have audio? is there thought to, I don't know if it has actually a screen or not, but if so, does it have large print capacity? And I know that may not directly relate to you, but if those machines are not accessible to the visually impaired, could that issue be addressed?
This is a federally funded project, so every single component of that must be ADA accessible. At a minimum, the machines can have braille on the buttons, but we are going to be definitely looking at some kind of audio support for the machines, and maybe even for the for crossing signals, and then on the bus to simplify and streamline. We are talking about some audio systems for the stations, help announce arrival of buses, or do other things again to really streamline that experience for the system. And I also want to make sure that I want to let you know that our final design team is listening right now, and they're taking all of your comments. So even though it is a legal requirement and this has to be done to be funded federally, but they're also taking notes and making sure that we are looking not at just the minimum requirement, but go above and beyond as we're talking about accessibility. Accessibility is a huge point of the conversation for this quarter. We want to make sure it's seamless for everyone and very easy to navigate, because that is how we get and attract users.
Yeah, that sounds great. Now, I hate that term minimal when it comes to the ADA, although you just said that you're going to go above and beyond. I wish some way that legal language could be taken out of that law, but it's not yet. But I'm going to give an example of teller machines at the bank for my next point about this accessibility. What happens is they can get you into the machine, but when it comes to, how much do I have left in savings, or what about my installment loan? These machines don't, at least the ones I'm familiar with, don't quite do that. So I just wanted to make sure to have you guys make sure that everything's addressed in the machine.
Sounds like we might have to do some prototyping and testing and bring different user groups to press the buttons and make sure everything is working properly.
Robert's your man.
I'll be glad to help with prototype. I wish I'd have known to help test these bank machines in that way too. But don't worry about it. I'm gonna have my chapter of the blind look into that one. We got to get these things doing it all the way.
Okay, Eric, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Mila's response to Ms. Barsness and the comment about getting people to the corridor. One thing I want to remind everybody is that we have several $1 million that was allocated as part of the 2017 transportation bond, specifically for the city to contribute towards these BRT projects to do exactly that. Mila pointed out that this is a federal project, and as such, we have some fairly tight restrictions on using federal money within the corridor itself. And so to do some of these side street connections for either sidewalk and or bike facilities would have to come from city funds exclusively. So we've already taken the steps of setting that money aside. Now with the area planning, it'll identify those links, and we'll start to do that. So that's in the pipeline and ultimately be part of the project.
Do any other commission members have questions or comments? I had one, just quick one. Mila, I think there's been some long-term strategic planning along the Blunt-Person corridors that involved creating a more multimodal experience. I did notice on your rendering with Blunt Street, it just showed a BRT lane, and I understand that there are space constraints there, but would really like to voice my concern over that ultimately. As somebody who uses that corridor often with my kids, we have to have an all ages and abilities facility that links those neighborhoods into our transit system. So I know that there are concurrently planning processes happening with both of these projects. might be cool to do like a joint meeting or something to show people how all of this is interacting, because it's a lot going on right now, and a lot of decision points happening for both of these projects. So just wanted to throw that idea out there, and to also let you know I was a little bit, where is the bike facility going to go on Blunt Street? And if we are not going to have a bike facility at all on Blunt Street, that's a deviation from an existing plan. So we would need to somehow make that whole.
Yes, that's a great point. As far as the project you referenced, we are definitely coordinating. As you said, there's so many moving pieces and so much information, and one impacts the other. So we are talking on a regular basis and looking at what each team is doing and trying to kind of move forward together. As far as joint event, I feel like we've been doing that, not specifically with one person project, but whenever we have BRT events, we always, before the project got consolidated, we always brought New Bern pedestrian improvements project to the table so people could attend one meeting and see that. And we always had representatives from housing neighborhoods to talk about some of the affordable housing options. So that would be a very logical next step to integrate those two, because you're right, they're very complicated and there's a lot of numerous decisions will be pretty impactful long term. And also as far as the existing bike lane, yes, obviously, if BRT and when BRT impacts existing facility, there are a couple of ways: either mitigate it on a parallel street or contribute funding to, another project, or, there's obviously this conversation, the policy level conversation, which we will be, haven't really scratched the surface there, but we will be addressing for the next 12 months as well, is are there any streets within downtown, understanding that the right-of-way is so significantly constrained, are there any streets where bikes and BRT buses could share a facility? Understanding this is not ideal, and this is not the ideal situation for all abilities, but there might be lower volume streets in some instances where that could be appropriate. Again, not trying to speak for or against that. This is just something that we're trying to think about, because we want to fit in so much into the downtown and make all systems very connected, but we all know that we are working within a very tight realm of very limited right.
Okay, so did you need us to vote to take action on, can you specifically indicate what the action is that you all need to vote on today?
Yes, the action, and Eric, you can do the formal action before the vote, but we would like to request a letter of support from BPAC and a support for bicycle and pedestrian improvements that are currently included in the New Bern Avenue BRT project.
Certainly, I think we would be in support of providing a letter of support for the inclusion of those amenities. Did you need us to take a formal action outside of providing a letter to you all, or, and I'm not, I'm an individual speaking right now, we can have a vote in a moment, but I think we're all interested in seeing as robust as possible bicycle and pedestrian amenities. I think some of the points that Elizabeth made, to the extent that it's ever possible, we're always going to want additional right-of-way allocated to ensure everybody has adequate space, recognizing that no bikes probably feel safe using any of the facilities that there are right now and are going to be on the sidewalk anyway. But how do we make it the best as possible?
Let me make a suggestion at this point, and Mila, if you can respond, if this works through your time frame. Let me ask that the commission table this item to the next meeting. We can draft a letter that incorporates all of this, and then have the commission approve the letter at the next meeting. Mila, is that okay for your time frame?
Yes, it certainly works. We're just trying to have some of the big pieces like this in place and understand we are all on the same page before we really dig into the design.
Okay. Well, we really appreciate this information tonight.
So then if there's no objection, then you can table this item and we'll have it as old business at your next meeting.
I'm comfortable with that. Let's do that. Thank you, Mila. Thank you, Hat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All sorry, what's the next item, Eric? I need to pull up the agenda.
Next item is Lumley Westgate. And if you give me a second, let me demote and promote some people here to the platform.
And can somebody vote me back in?
Hello, Susan.
You were just recused for the item, so you're automatically back in.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Oh, should we?
So for this next item, we have Ruben Moore. Ruben is a project manager, senior project manager with our engineering services department. We have been working on developing projects within the Lumley, Westgate, Ebenezer Church corridors for several years now, and we've had some fits and starts with the public. We've had some interference from major disruptor projects. We now have this project back on track, and Ruben's going to review with you where we're at with this. So give me 1 second. I will fire up his presentation.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great.
Go ahead, Ruben.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Thank you, BPAC, for letting me come to you tonight with this presentation. And I want to apologize that we haven't got a presentation to you on this project sooner. Like Eric said, we have had a few things happen during the project. Next slide. So I just want to give you a little bit of background. The source of the project was it came out of a Triangle Commuter Bike Initiative as a long-term vision for some bicycling connections in the greater Triangle area, specifically a network, part of a network between Durham and Raleigh and Research Triangle Park. Next slide. So a little bit about project history. This goes back to the bicycle plan that was adopted in 2009. This corridor project was included in the bond referendum of 2011, and we had authorization for a two-part contract with Stewart Engineering that started with a feasibility study that took place beginning in June of 2014 and was completed in December of 2015. Next slide. Then in June of 2016, we entered a new contract with Stewart for design services, and this was to reach a construction level contract. We had public meetings in 2018. Our early design meeting was in February, and an advanced design meeting was in August. And we had a special stakeholder meeting January of 2019. As you may know, the Metro Park is a planning district outside or adjacent to Umstead State Park. And the first 12 or 13 properties on the project that are on the border of the state park are in this Metro Park area. And they had some special concerns, and we met with them in January of 2019. And then we had other coordination meetings last year also with the Department of Transportation, Raleigh-Durham Airport, and Martin Marietta Quarry on different design tales, and also to hear part of their expansion plans. Next slide, please. So the budget for the project is at $2.4 million, and this includes bicycle facilities on Lumley Road, Westgate Road, and Ebenezer Church Road. And we have a location map there that shows the 5 sections of the project with a breakdown of the section mileage shown. Next slide, please. And some of the facility types that the project uses, buffered bike lanes is one of the more common design elements. And then in several places, we use a multi-use path. And closer into Umstead State Park, we actually use something called advisory bike lanes. Next slide. So earlier this year, we got into some very detailed numbers looking at what we had in the budget and what we could afford. We had an updated opinion of probable cost completed by Stewart, and our real estate section looked at the parcel maps and gave us a fairly detailed analysis of what our likely real estate cost would be. And so we have these costs are shown on this slide by segment, which we have color coded. And you can see that if we total all the cost of all the 5 sections, construction cost, right-of-way cost, and what we've spent on the feasibility study and the design contract, this would run to about $5.8 million. And one thing I wanted to show on this slide is the 2 yellow sections up there on Lumley Road. That's a section that the airport authority is proposing a future realignment of Lumley Road. And so if we built anything today on Lumley Road, it's very likely we would have to rebuild it or have it part of a future construction contract when that realignment happens. And then there's an error on this thing. It says there's no proposed bike facility where the quarry alignment is. There actually is. It's just at a lower tier level from what our bike plan, from what our project would like to have. The bike facility on the realignment around the quarry is a shared lane westbound adjacent to a sidewalk. So there is the option to bike on the sidewalk in that area or also use a shared lane with traffic. And then eastbound on that quarry realignment section, there's a 4-foot paved shoulder. So there is some type of bike facility already on that yellow section where it says quarry realignment. So it really shouldn't say that there's nothing there. But this project did not propose to do anything additional at that location. Next slide, please. So as part of the public input sessions, we did ask for public feedback on what the public felt like was the priority to the city for construction of the sections. And basically they ranked kind of in reverse order, making a connection into Umstead State Park was the driving force. Basically they wanted this built in kind of in reverse, like get us to the park first and then expand outwards from the park. And if we can get all the way to Leesville Road, which is the far end on the east side in section 3, and then to Briar Creek, which is the far western end in section 1, that would be the priority. Like basically work from the primary destination that people were saying they wanted to go to, which was the state park, and then work out from there. Next slide, please. So we have a schedule at this point. Our division manager is making a presentation to council July 7th, the next council meeting. And if we get the blessings to proceed with our recommendations, we think we can complete property acquisition this coming winter, advertise for bids this winter, award construction and get all set up for construction to happen the beginning of next year, and take a little over a year to complete construction. Next slide, please. So we have a plan to move forward, and kind of what I'm here for tonight is to we're asking for your blessings with what we are able to do with the budget that we have at this time. We'd like to finish the plans for design and construction of segments 4 and 5, which basically would be Grayland Avenue, which is your access into Umstead State Park, and then the entirety of the Ebenezer Church Road portion that's in this project from Grayland, the park access, all the way up to the intersection of Westgate Road. And that, again, our allocated funding is about $2.4 million. We do have an estimated cost of about 2.8, but this construction estimate was done in February, and we've actually been getting some pretty good bid prices since February. Economy is getting a little bit more competitive, and we do have about a 20% fudge factor in the construction cost. So there's a good chance we can get some decent bids and get 2 sections of this project built. And as part of that recommendation, we would defer segments 1, 2, and 3 to a future project. Specifically, it's been mentioned that since Section 3 connects over to Leesville Road, if the city moves forward, or if and when the city moves forward with the Leesville Road project, we could use that opportunity to connect from Leesville Road over to the intersection of Ebenezer Church Road. And we do have we still have ongoing coordination details with DOT in the Lumley and Westgate Road areas. So if we did follow through with this plan to do 4 and 5, we don't have any design questions with DOT in these 2 segments. But we haven't worked out everything that DOT would allow in the Lumley and Westgate sections. Next slide. And so I've had this project since I came to work for the city, and probably got more information on this than anyone else. And I'd love to answer any questions you may have about where we are and where we're going.
You know, Eric, would it be possible to pull up the slides where we could reference segments 4 and 5?
Yes, just 1 second.
Okay, and I see Susan, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about the advisory bike lanes and where they're being used on that plan. I guess I don't quite understand.
Okay, so there's a right angle turn on Ebenezer Church Road where it's a T intersection, and if you go straight through the T, it goes into Umstead Park on a side road called Grayland Road. And so that's a very low volume traffic road, probably just a couple hundred cars a day. And a lot of that traffic, I think historically, has gone down to the end of the road and parked for people to access going into the park. So there's a technique for putting in pavement markings to where bicycles are identified as using the outsides of the roadway, and traffic basically is given the center of the road in 1 lane, and traffic is expected to yield to bicycles and take turns using the center lane if they ever need to pass a bicycle. So it's basically it's a 1 lane, 2-way traffic roadway.
Have we ever used this in Raleigh before?
Not to my knowledge.
No, this would be new.
Places. Sorry, Eric.
I would say that this would be new.
Yeah, this would be new.
And there is one that exists in Durham. It is a contraflow. Sorry. Yeah, it's a contraflow bike lane in the wrong direction on a 1-way street near Duke East campus. But it's a similar concept.
But on the map, it would be for this one portion that's here just south of the turn where Ebenezer makes that hard angle turn. This portion is called Grayland Drive. And this would be the portion from that intersection down to the park entrance that would be an advisory bike lane.
Oh, well, the only reason I ask, and my concern is that if it's not something people are used to doing, will they actually do it? Or will there be no room for bicycles?
Susan, this is Dwight. As a user of that little section down there, it is really low traffic, and it's pretty comfortable now as it is. And I think these advisory bike lanes are a really cool idea, and it'd be great to get some on the ground and be able to show some success and maybe use them elsewhere. So this is a really good spot for it.
I should also mention too that we do have a parallel facility planned next to the roadway here. So on that section of Ebenezer Church Road, we would have a 10-foot multi-use path from Glenwood down to the right angle turn in Ebenezer Church Road. And then that paved trail would feed bicycles to the pavement of Grayland, but the trail itself would continue as like a mulch trail for hikers or people who have mountain bikes and are comfortable biking off the pavement could stay on that off-road trail. So it's the choice is there either way for cyclists.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments from the commission? So thank you so much for this presentation. I did have one question. We were looking at a few different facility type renderings where it was either a buffered bike lane or a more protected type of facility, a mixed-use path, it looks like, Ruben. Along this corridor for segments 4 and 5, distribution be along the corridor?
So, Eric, I don't know if you wanted to pull up that section map or not, but basically all of Section 5 would be a 10-foot wide multi-use path. So as it crosses Glenwood, it would be like a marked pedestrian bicycle crossing with pedestrian signals, and would go all the way up to, there's a little black arrow there where Marvino Lane is. Mm-hmm. And then at the Marvino Lane intersection, the multi-use path would transition to on-road bike lanes. And there's some existing sidewalk in that area. So the users of the multi-use path could split between pedestrians and cyclists. And then there's about a block or two of existing bike lanes that were created through the resurfacing program. We don't have any plans to change that. And I believe they're already buffered, maybe a 2-foot buffer. But then further north, we would, under this project, have to widen the roadway as if we were building paved shoulders, and those paved shoulders would become the buffered bike lane. And I believe we were doing I want to say it's a 3-foot buffer and a 5-foot lane on both sides of the road, all the way up to Westgate Road.
Okay. Yeah, I would feel like the on-road facilities aren't going to feel like all ages and abilities facility. I mean, it's just becoming a little bit, the further north you get, the more suburban it gets to. And I feel like it would not be doing anything to get mode shift along the corridor for a facility. But if you said, were you moving the curb on, did you say, on portions of that?
So that part of Ebenezer Church Road is, it looks like a fairly rural 2-lane paved road with shoulders. You get north of some of the subdivision development, and there are no curb lines. So we would widen it and keep it without curbs, but have it with what looked like a paved shoulder, but they would be marked as bike lanes. Now, we've also identified, early in this project, we identified a need for sidewalk up here because there's a couple of places where there's gaps in the sidewalk. But since we had the budget that we have, we said we can't do that with this project. So this is, honestly, this has turned into mostly a bicycle project. The biggest bulk of sidewalk that was ever in the project was in Section 3, and it was mostly there because it was replacing sidewalk that we would have to tear up to widen the road to get the bike lanes in. So by using a multi-use path from the park up to Marvino, at least that one is both for bicycles and pedestrians. But then once you get to Marvino, it's you've got existing sidewalks, but then you've got, from that point on, this is mostly a bicycle project.
Right. I guess my heartburn is we have been, as a commission, trying to, if it's not an all ages and abilities facility, we need to question, we're not, what's the point of doing that? And and I guess I think this is a great project, and I am really in support of this happening, but just wanted to provide that counter discussion. And I would be curious too, how are we looking at metrics and performance when we do put facilities down? How are we measuring for the types of users who are coming on the corridor and afterwards? Not just the counts, but the types of folks that are using it. I know that that's a pretty robust and in-depth conversation, but I think it's something, if we're looking to quantify the value of an investment, I think we need to start doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Do other folks have thoughts? Oh, I don't want to compromise all this.
So I'd say that I'm normally right there with you with the off-road facilities conversation, Mary. In this case, I think that this would probably end up serving the confident and what's the word I'm looking for? The enthused and confident folks. This seems kind of like for them. The destination we're seeming to connect to is Umstead Park, and I think it'll get a lot of use from the tri guys and the runners and the bikers. There's not as much generating local foot traffic for like retail or restaurants in this area.
Well, yeah, but parks should be for children too, right? But yeah, I agree, man. I know what you're talking. My husband always gets up there and bikes to get it.
How is the transit in the area? Is especially where they pass over 70, are we aware of any transit stops here?
Or any?
Oh, you're muted, Eric.
Sorry. There is some express transit service along the US 70 corridor now. And that's going to expand. There's a future project to do some improvements and widen this portion of Glenwood from Millbrook to Lumley. And as part of that, we'll be adding sidewalks and a multi-use trail all the way along this. So these improvements are laying the groundwork to tie into that additional long-term improvement.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, when we get to Marvino Lane, there's actually a whole network of buffered bike lanes that, with one small exception that's outside the city limits, goes all the way over to the Leesville Safe Routes Project and ties all the way over to Leesville Road.
Okay. Yeah. So there's always the ability to add bollards or some type of other physical protection down the line.
You have to be careful out here because there's mailboxes. And the last thing we want to do is pull in a federal agency and the Postal Carriers Union into the discussions. It's actually pretty.
I mean, there's the physical capability to do it.
Yeah, there is. Having ridden out here, and again, this is coming from me, so take it with a grain of salt. It's actually pretty comfortable out here, and I saw a number of families out biking. In fact, if I said there's an impediment, it was actually the topography more than the traffic. It's actually pretty hilly out here. But in terms of seeing folks using the buffered bike lanes, particularly on country trail, there were a lot of families that were out using them. I was out there on a Saturday or Sunday morning, and they were actually getting pretty well used.
But let's measure that too. Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, where is this on Leesville Road? Is that project still going forward? What is the connection at the number 3? I guess, I mean, how do we keep this going? And will it get to the parks and neighborhoods over that way?
So I can address that. And again, what's being recommended by staff right now is exclusively using the money that was allocated for the project for segments 4 and 5. Segments 1, 2, and 3 would have to be funded through other means. And so one of the things that we found was that the section of segment 3 for Westgate was going to have to be widened to be able to provide facilities. A lot of that is a 2 or 3 lane road now. So there's going to have to be a lot more. It was not just a matter of paint or restriping. It was going to be some significant physical improvements. The Leesville Road project that intersected at Westgate, most of the road work's been done to the north. Some of that will need to be retrofit for bike lanes at some point. The project to the south was originally funded as part of the 2017 transportation bond, but as part of the council's action last week in adopting the budget, that project was shelved as part of the council's budget adoption. So the Leesville Road project from Westgate to O'Neill is being deferred to a future budget, future transportation bond. And there are a lot of issues about that we can explain at another time, but that's the current situation.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just wondering, I thought it was improved up to the north, and yeah, it's exciting to get things done.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and take a vote unless there are any other comments or questions. I'm scanning through right now. Are we good? Are we good?
Got one.
Okay.
I just got one quick question.
Okay.
Are there any considerations to improve the pedestrian crossing for segment 5 or top of 70 Glenwood, or is that out of our hands?
Is Ruben muted?
Okay, I think I'm back. There are curb improvements in the radius to have wheelchair ramps that connect from the intersections on the east side of Ebenezer to the trail, which would be on the west side. But I think our current city policy is that we would not actually mark those as crosswalks because there's no physical or signal protection.
I think I saw Elizabeth's hand too. I'm sorry if I missed anybody else. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Just a thought, maybe not possible, but since we're eliminating sidewalks from the scope of this project, wondering if there might be any utility in thinking of this as an on-road multi-use path. That's something we keep talking about. We keep losing sidewalks because they're so expensive to construct. And I don't know if we'll get a sidewalk out here anytime soon. I don't know where it is on our backlog list of decades. But I mean, you have the legal right to walk in the road, but it might be worth a little bit of paint to reinforce that.
And bollards.
Oh, definitely some bollards would be great.
So a consideration of a more tactical approach, or we could do something outside of our typical, just being more creative with our, if we don't have the finances to do a sidewalk, do we have the finances to reallocate a portion of the road with paint and bollards for a mixed use path or something of that nature, I think is what.
Yeah. I mean, if we're not going to get a sidewalk out there for a decade, but people would like to walk, what is their alternative?
Okay. I think, do you have a response at all to that, or just for information?
Hello?
Okay.
I think to Elizabeth's point, I wanted to point out that one of the side streets there goes into a neighborhood called Pat's Branch that has sidewalk in the neighborhood. And so our project would connect that sidewalk up to the road and then put in the ramps for crossing at that intersection.
That's a start.
Okay.
It just doesn't get you along the corridor.
Well,
it doesn't get you out of your neighborhood.
Well, the multi-use path, I mean, it's...
Yeah, where the multi-use path is, it's great. I just thought I heard you refer to a place where you had to eliminate the sidewalks in lieu of just on-road bike facilities. Okay. Is that correct?
Okay, so the Pat's Branch where I'm talking about, it's like maybe a half a mile from the park entrance. Mm-hmm. And then the location where we identified a 1,400-foot gap that it would take to connect sidewalk up to between two existing components. Mm-hmm. It's basically at the intersection of Westgate Road, so that's about 2 miles from the entrance of the park. So I'm hopeful that stays on the list for future sidewalk.
It's a long list.
I know.
All right, so let's...
Time, though. It should do something.
Right. And that's not something we have typically had a toolkit to do anything with. So that's something that staff, Paul, Eric, Ruben, everyone, let's create that toolkit. Let's create that toolbox so that we can, instead of saying we have this other coffer that has a long list and is very expensive, let's look at ways that we could be more agile to solutions in more near term.
Yeah, we're not making a lot of headway on that list. I mean, relative to the entire list.
Right. All right. So let's take a motion now in support or not in support of the project. All in favor of what's the specific? Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, if you're gonna make a motion, someone would need to make a motion to endorse the project. And there'll be a second, then any discussion, and then a vote.
And can we provide amendments to the endorsement?
You can make recommendations. You can make suggestions. Sure.
Hatchell will move to endorse the project.
Okay. And would we second that and then make our amendments? Sorry.
You amend it first.
Amend. I feel like there might be an amendment from Elizabeth. Would you like to suggest that
Sure.
we should look at innovative solutions?
Yeah, I'd suggest a friendly amendment that we look at ways of providing space for the pedestrians within the roadbed, whether that's through markings, bollards, et cetera, kind of an atypical approach so that there are no pedestrian gaps within this project.
I am fine with your amendment.
Thank you.
All in favor, or can I get a second?
Yeah.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, rock and roll.
And Madam Chair, I just need to point out that Kelly had to leave the meeting.
Okay.
And so I would suggest that she be excused for the remainder of the meeting. If there's
I excuse Kelly. Bye, Kelly. See you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, next item, I can pull up the agenda, but if you have it ready, Eric.
The next item is Paul. Mr. Black is going to talk about work zone closures.
And it'll be short and sweet because we're knocking on 2.5 hours.
Not that we're counting, but continue.
All right. So Eric, if you can pull up the presentation, it's just a couple of quick slides. With all the construction in downtown and some of the projects starting to overlap one another or bump into each other, and then DOT construction downtown, we started running into issues with closures of the sidewalk in particular. There are also some encroachments into bike lanes that are temporary in nature, but define temporary. Is it 6 months? Is it 2 years? What does that really mean? And what happens when you have a whole string of them down a corridor? So what we look at now officially, the Unified Development Ordinance references the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices and how they deal with temporary closures. Next slide. So the MUTCD, to save a little time, says these things. You can see them in the bullets. But the big thing is you can't sever a route. You've got to make sure there's some way to get through, some kind of passable detour. But then with that passable detour, that first bullet at the very end of the first sentence talks about convenient. What does that mean? And that's really what we're coming to the BPAC to talk about. Next slide. So what are we talking about? We're looking for something to give the development services staff some sort of hard and fast, bright lines in the sand that they can start a conversation with when they're working with the development community. So what are some things they should look at? The staff have come up with looking at pedestrian volumes, looking at some kind of surrogate for pedestrian delay. If you've got to cross a 2-lane street that has under 10,000 cars a day, that's not terrible. If you've got to cross a busy 4-lane that has 20,000 cars a day, that's a very different thing. So, what does that mean? And then pedestrian safety. Do we have corridors where there have been higher than average pedestrian crashes? We maybe don't want to put pedestrians across that roadway more than we have to. One of the other things we talked about, do we just want to say that there are some corridors where you will leave a pedestrian walkway on both sides? And what would those be? Would they be linked to transit? Would they be linked to the PED volumes? What might that look like? And so those were sort of the things in the staff brainstorm that we came up with. But we wanted to come back to the BPAC and let you know that this is an issue. And next slide. Is it moving? There it goes. We actually have at the city something that goes into a little more detail. We give it to the development community to work out. What we're going to ask is that this go to the pedestrian committee for some additional work. Looking specifically at these 3 things that are in our current manual, and by reference, some of the things from the Americans for Disabilities Act and the MUTCD requirements, and looking at finding ways to codify those, which is the last slide. I told you I'd be short and sweet.
Sounds good to me. I support sending that to the pedestrian committee.
Yeah, I move.
When the bike lane ends, how is that? Is that just going to be sent to the bike committee? Because that's been happening a lot downtown too.
Yeah, that's somewhat less problematic because technically the bikes can still use the travel lane. It's not comfortable, but we haven't severed it completely. But we really don't want to put pedestrians out there in the travel lane for the cars.
Right, agreed. I just wonder if there could be some tweaks that we could make, signage, small things we could do to improve that for everybody.
It's at your pleasure. So if you think we need to send part of it to the bike committee, please go ahead.
For just minor input, Dwight, would you be receptive to that?
I think I'd prefer to see what the pedestrian committee has to say about it first, honestly.
Oh, of course. I think I would say 90% of this goes to the pedestrian committee for them to discuss. I think that there are modifications that could or should happen to ensure that the motorists are aware of the bicycle facility abruptly merging into their lane as well.
And I think too, we haven't had separated facilities before. When you go to close a separated facility, it's a completely different animal. So we will start running into this on the bike side eventually, but we've still got a little time.
Right. I mean, I can tell you, I experienced a lot on Hillsborough Street. That was my bike and bus corridor, and there was a lot going on, and it wasn't safe, and it wasn't done. There could be some tweaks.
Yeah, so I'd be happy for us to take a look at it.
Just on some minor things. And Elizabeth, if you want to take 90% of the bulk of this and dive into some formative things that could happen, that would be awesome, I think.
Sounds good. I'm hoping that we can come up with something that'll minimize the closures, period. So.
Sounds good to me.
Using it for parking. That's what they're doing. And lay down.
And the pedestrian committee might consider this too, but Paul, you mentioned ADA. When it comes to all the construction that have been done to make the curbs more accessible, the yellow domes have been put, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, no, that's true. The truncated domes.
Yeah. I think I like them because they're bright, and I think they're wheelchair user safe as well. But boy, I had the dickens of a time, because I didn't see that they were there initially. I got away there, and the workers were waving me across the street. So here's my point: there are audible signals, and I wanted to address the issue of them being used by the city more, and maybe our committee could address that also. But has that come up, or do you know about them?
It is, and we actually took some of your concerns, and you've seen Jed Niffenegger's come before this body before.
The what?
And those are actually quite expensive. They are not cheap to install, and so right now, in terms of our current budget, we're still having to deploy them strategically. But that's really a question for Jed's group right now. We can certainly get him in front of at least the committee.
Is the question about using them for detours or permanent? The detour costs can be passed on.
I think I'm not sure if I made it clear what I was talking about. When they put those things on the orange and white, I don't know what you call them.
Yeah, so they'd be the temporary ones.
Not the cones, but the wooden.
The barricades.
The barricades. There are some barricades that have an audible signal. It makes a beeping noise, and I don't think that's as expensive as what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, those. Okay, yeah, that's something I think that we should entertain as part of that. And again, we can communicate that back to the development team and let them know that's going to be something we expect.
Okay.
Sounds good. Well, we'll look to have some good conversations on this in the pedestrian subcommittee. You don't need anything else from us, like an action on that, right?
Nope.
Okay, moving on.
All right. This one's a little bit of a moot point. We were forced to move forward in order to make the contract and the marking season deadline. And council's already voted on this. So it's informational at this point. You can look at what's in your packet, but these are the bike lane resurfacings for 2020. They include, what have we got here? Thistledown, which is just west of NC State Centennial Campus between Trailwood and Gorman. It's going to tie into a longer corridor that includes Lineberry, which we are looking at creating a separated bike facility all the way to Sierra. Sierra is a neighborhood bikeway that's slated to then connect up to our project on Carolina Pines that will get you all the way over to South Saunders. So this is one little piece of a much larger puzzle. Delta Lake and Hardemont are in other sort of more suburban parts of town. I should note that Hardemont, we actually did shoulders on. Eric, was that 2015? Was that one of the early projects? So this completes the other end of it, and we are starting to look at revisiting what went in on the west side of Hardemont now that we have a complete way all the way across. There's a lot of residential on-street parking here. I can't make any promises, but we are going to open it up and revisit it to see if conditions have changed, and it might be something we could go back for. We're getting some on Kelway, and I want to say there, Eric, is there one more? No, I think that's all I'm seeing in the handout. We've got some other stuff in the works in terms of doing some separation on existing buffered bike lanes. You heard Lineberry, where we have a portion. We are going to go ahead and do a standalone marking project that's led as part of this same contract to complete it all the way down to Trailwood. So Trailwood, which is an NCDOT street between there and Thistledown, will be the only gap over there. We're also going to put in, industrial is missing. That's what's not on here because we were designing that up to the 11th hour. I know, Mary, this is a project that you're interested in. This will connect the Crabtree Creek Greenway, informally at least. There are a couple of easements across private property at the dead end of Industrial Drive that people have been using. But you can use it to access the Costco and the Trader Joe's and the Trek Bicycle Shop and the Wegmans. We expect this will see a lot of use. We're also going to be putting in one of our permanent pedestrian counters at this location.
So you had discussed how some of these may be candidates for separated bike facilities. What's the timeline for addition of bollards, if addition of bollards will be happening?
Right now, I'm just trying to get them on the ground. So none of these were on that initial list. I imagine industrial is one that could come back pretty quickly.
Right. I'd be curious on that. All right, well, we'll stay tuned. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Paul. Next item.
Next item is the chair's report, Madam Chair.
Whew, I tell you what, y'all just trying to parent through this pandemic over here. I have been seeing these notes about House Bill 77. I would be curious how that's going to impact funding considerations for y'all's department.
Yeah, so right now, the initial assessment, let's go big picture for 1 second. So there's been some significant cost shortages, revenue shortages for NCDOT. And this is sort of a perfect storm of things. So DOT, about 2 or 3 years ago, had a surplus of over $2 billion. And Secretary at the time, Secretary Jim Trogdon, directed NCDOT to spend that money down. They did it in spades and then got themselves into a bind. And part of it was, there's a lot of factors in this. The bottom line is they dipped below their floor of they're mandated by the General Assembly to have a floor of at least $250 million in cash on hand. They went below that. That led to a suspension of projects. They terminated some contracts with part-time employees and consultants. But some of the collateral damage from this spending freezes has been freezes on some of the projects the City of Raleigh and other municipalities have done that involve locally administered project program funds that come to the MPO. The House bill is an attempt to make some formal cuts that deal with those funding shortages and do some financial rearrangements at NCDOT. The big hit has been that we get money back from statewide gas taxes, and a lot of it's municipalities all across North Carolina get funds back based on a pro rata share, largely based on population and how many miles of roads that each of the municipalities maintain. There's a provision in the current bill that says specifically Raleigh and Charlotte will have about a 35% cut in their POW bill revenues just for 1 year. And so for Raleigh, that's about a $3 million plus hit in our funds that we get back from NCDOT currently. There's also been some noise about different programs within NCDOT that would have to have drawdowns, and it's across the board. It's highway, it's bike and ped, it's train. So we're waiting to see what happens with this bill in terms of its progress through the legislature, and just have to stay tuned.
Okay. Yeah, it did seem pretty sobering. I mean, some of the information that was going out said that there was just a zeroing out of funding for bike, ped, and transit.
It's not a zeroing out based on what I've seen. And again, the bill's in flux. It could be changing relatively quickly. It's moving from committee to committee right now, so it's active.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Any other question? Well, that's the chair's report. I'm good. Next, what's up?
Next is your committee reports.
We haven't been meeting. Next month, we will have reports for everybody.
Very good. So the next item is staff reports. So first, I I've had Fontaine on the call this afternoon, waiting patiently. So many of you know that Fontaine has been the project manager behind our bike share implementation. And so as you've seen, we have all 30 of the bike share stations open and operational. What you haven't seen is the behind the scenes work that we've done working with our contractor and working with our vendor, BWegan, to finalize the installation of those projects. In many cases, we worked to get the stations up and running, but hadn't yet connected the power or finished some of the markings or delineators around those stations. And we've been finalizing that work now with BWegan. And so we are nearing the finish line. We have 27 of the 30 projects finalized out from an engineering standpoint, with 3 more projects left to go. Fontaine, is that still right? Is it still just 3? Okay. So 2. We're down to 2. Okay, very good. So and then ultimately we finish the process with NCDOT and get reimbursed, as this was a federally funded project, that we get money back from NCDOT towards this project. So Fontaine, did you want to add anything to this?
Nope, you just about covered it.
Just want to thank Fontaine for all of her work on this project. She'll now transition to another role within my division. Barbara Godwin is also on the call this evening, and she will be managing the project going forward as far as phase 2 and the day-to-day oversight of the system.
So yeah, it's nice to meet everyone virtually. I look forward to working with you guys and meeting in person sooner, hopefully rather than later.
Ms. Esther, do you have a question?
I have a question. I just want to say congratulations. I see so many people riding these bikes all around, like all parts of Raleigh, and I just kind of wanted to reflect, like, awesome job having this done by the pandemic. It seems to be going really well. I see all types of people riding these bikes, so just, kudos to you guys for that. It's really well done.
Well, if you didn't hear a couple of weeks ago, it got drowned out in a lot of the noise of all the things that are going on, but we surpassed 100,000 miles on the system in terms of how many miles have been ridden. We surpassed 50,000 rides. So really, so far, the system is operating in excess of our projections for ridership. And we are so happy with the success so far.
Thanks, y'all.
In other news, as far as things going on with the city council, the council did adopt the budget last week. There were some last minute changes with the budget where city staff, as part of the transportation bond allocation, had allocated $1 million towards streetscape implementation. As part of the council deliberation on the final budget, there was a request to amend the draft budget and move $500,000 from that streetscape allocation explicitly for bikeway implementation. And there was discussion explicitly about protected bikeway network. So we're working up, as part of the work the commission has done recently relative to prioritization of facilities. We'll be having that discussion with the city council on talking about which of those segments of the network will have the best bang for the buck. We already have some funds that were allocated as part of the transportation bond that the $500,000 that's left will be contributed to that. And so, sorry, I saw a cat. I apologize.
We're slap happy at this point.
It's all good. It's all good. It's late.
He has ADD. No, I'm kidding.
So we've got funds that are allocated for streetscape. We'll be also having a conversation with the city council based on your recent work, talking about prioritization of streetscape projects. We'll be taking that to them and getting a final list together. Fontaine will be working on developing streetscape projects going forward. But we're excited that we've now got an allocation that's directly for bicycle projects in addition to money that we already had in the budget. So we'll have some expectations that we'll be rolling out the next batch of projects next summer.
Thank you for that update.
Mm-hmm. Paul, Fontaine, Barbara, did I leave anything out we needed to cover?
I just wanted to add one thing quickly, talking about ridership for the bike share program. Something that we've noticed over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic is that ridership trends are suggesting longer trip durations. So this could possibly mean that trips are being used for recreational purposes rather than commuter options right now. So I just wanted to highlight that fact that even though it's not being used as a transportation tool as much during the pandemic, that it's still getting heavy ridership and people are still utilizing this.
Joy tool, like mental health. People at the art museum, where I've seen them mostly, are people who clearly haven't ridden a bike in a long time, and they are so happy. So it's just as important.
I'm living that experience right now. So many thanks to all the hands involved in setting up the Citrix bikes.
You cannot buy a bike, even if you wanted to right now. So it's really fantastic.
Paul, what you got?
Yeah, I actually did have one thing. Eric, do you want to mention the Slow Streets implementation?
Oh, yeah, and also one other project as well. So a number of communities across the country worked on implementing a variety of measures to allow for improved social distancing. And different communities approached it in different ways. We ultimately worked with the city council to do a pilot implementation of a shared streets campaign. And so we looked at one street in each council district that we effectively limited through traffic for and provided additional signage at each entrance to indicate that the street was limited, no through traffic allowed. There was branding associated with that for both Bike and Ped and for the Shared Streets Initiative. And so we've got 5 initial streets deployed. We're looking at what a next phase would look like, whether we add to that or rotate those streets. So that was something that we had a lot of interest from the city council on implementing. The other project to make the commission aware of is that we got approval for the downtown north-south Greenway project at the last city council meeting. The phase 1 of that project is going to run from Martin Street to North Street. And we opted to stop it at North Street for the time being because of all the construction that's happening along both of those streets north of that point between North Street and P Street with all the Smoky Hollow redevelopment that's happening right now. But we anticipate that once those projects start to wrap up, we'll then be able to go back and reclaim those street frontages and extend the limits all the way eventually to P Street is the goal in both West and Harrington Street. So council was enthusiastic and unanimous in their support for the project. So we appreciate the commission's work and support on that project. And while I'm talking, I just want to take a minute and thank the commission for their patience as we've gone through our first virtual meeting. I know we had a lot on the agenda tonight, but I know the commission's not met in several months. So thank you everyone for your time and your diligence this evening.
Thank you all. I know this was a big lift. Hopefully next time will be a shorter meeting because we'll have lots to cover and it'll be easier to get things going. I did see that there was some public feedback on some of the shared streets. Did you guys receive that just on placement of signage and that type of stuff?
Yes, we did see that from one person. Yes.
Okay. And you guys have a survey that you'll be receiving or an email, I guess, that you have set up to receive additional feedback along the corridor? Who is managing that
that's
account?
The case. Paul, is that correct?
Yeah, actually, Rob gave me the update, and yeah, there's an email associated with the project citywide. And there's also a postcard mailer going out to everybody in the affected corridors to solicit feedback. So we'll see where it goes. There isn't a formal survey set up that I'm aware of.
And you all are monitoring that email account, or who is?
Rob in communications is doing that.
All right. Sounds good. Well, we don't have Paul Neville here to share any upcoming events with us, but I think things are pretty, virtual these days anyway. So
yeah, I can tell you one of the other hats I wear is I'm on the board of the North Carolina Bicycle Club, and pretty much everything is canceled, right. At least through the fall at this point. And we're not holding out hope for a lot of events in the fall. I think the earliest thing I've seen is in September, and we don't expect that to hold.
All right. Well, as soon as we have subcommittee meetings scheduled for the next month, if those occur, we will share those publicly and go from there. Really appreciate everybody coming out tonight.
Otherwise, your next regularly scheduled meeting is July 20th.
All right. Calendar.
Are we going to have committee meetings?
I'm going to try.
As content comes up, yes, there is a desire to start to convene.
Well, the pedestrian committee just got stuff to do, so I was just wondering, I don't know what our normally scheduled time is. I think I missed a few, and Elizabeth
Go
is.
back on that.
I'm
It
trying
might
to
be different
remember.
people's schedules right now.
Elizabeth, do you remember? It was either the second or the third Thursday around lunchtime.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to go back and see if we settled on the second or third. I don't remember.
I think it's supposed to be the 3rd from 11 to noon, maybe?
It was the mayor's committee meets on third Thursdays, and I think ours is the third Thursday from 1 to 2, because the mayor's committee was from 12 to 1.
Yeah, because I see that we had an ad hoc in July scheduled, and we had been attempting to put them back to back, and that was the third Thursday, the 16th.
Okay. So let's just go ahead and if you're okay with that as chair of the committee, we'll go ahead and assume that. And I think same for bike committee. Are we still good, Dwight, with meeting an hour prior to BPAC?
Sounds good to me. All right. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate everybody's time. Oh, yes, Elizabeth. I'm sorry.
Can I know that it's time to go, but can I make a request for a future agenda item? Just in the past week, we have lost at least 2 community members who have been run over by cars and died. And it happens so often now that we don't even talk about it. But I would love to understand when those accidents happen, how we as a city deal with it, whether or not I think the police report is forwarded to somebody. Do they do an investigation of what could be improved? Do we have a fund to do safety improvements in places where there's documented issues? So that spans across pedestrians and cyclists. So I thought that might be a good future work item, or at least an item for a report to the full commission.
So I was made aware that we actually installed rapid rectangular flashing beacons at the Gorman Street Greenway crossing as an interim measure until the hawk goes in. That happened, I think, today.
That's great. Is there one over by Marsh Creek as well? I'm getting the name wrong. Over by where the other pedestrian fatality.
Sunnybrook and Walnut Creek.
Walnut
Yeah.
Creek. Yes, that is on. If it's not already installed, it's on the way. Yes.
Okay. I know both of them were on the waiting list, and I'm hoping we could get an interim measure. You might lose track of the people that have been killed in crosswalks over the past year.
Something else for the pedestrian subcommittee to dig into, Elizabeth, if that would be a point of discussion that could start to be.
Potentially, I just think it spans. I mean, we've had a cyclist killed in an intersection to downtown in the past year. So,
yeah. All right. I think it makes sense to bring that before the full commission, just saying if you wanted to get started on some stuff.
Yeah, of course.
Format.
Mary?
Yes, Robert.
As a minister, I'd be willing to lead moments of silence when appropriate, if that's allowed, with our city.
It does feel like honoring these people as human beings who have died in our roads would be appropriate. I mean, maybe that's a moment of silence and just knowing their names.
Let's see. I'll give us some thought. We'll bring it up next meeting.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Robert.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for meeting tonight. Thank you for your good ideas. I think we're ready to wrap this rodeo up. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right.
Oh, adjourned? Did I say that? Okay.